Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to episode 97 of the Social Media and Politics Podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Pacetta, political scientist at Lund University. Remember, you can connect with the show on Twitter by following us at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in, and welcome to the fourth annual Social Media and Politics Year in Review, together with Dr. Anna Maria Ducek-Segiston. She is an assistant professor in European Studies at Lund University and the viceroy for the Center for European Studies at Lund University.
Thank you for the upgrade. I would like to be the viceroy of the Admiralty of the Star Wars.
There you go.
That's kind of the theme, right?
Baby Yoda has me very much in a Star Wars mood, and the new movie coming out very soon.
I think it's already out, at least in Sweden. So yes, I'm also thinking quite a lot about the Star Wars, and I would love to be the viceroy of anything, really.
Yes, of course, Viceroy Newt Gunray. He was the viceroy of the Trade Federation who conspired with Darth Sidious to launch the blockade and subsequent invasion of Naboo. Which I looked up a viceroy. Do you know what a viceroy actually is politically?
No, I actually don't. Maybe like a prime minister?
It's an official who runs like a country or colony in the name of a monarch. So I think it's kind of
like the lieutenant of the monarch in some province.
Exactly. And since I guess we don't have so much colonialism anymore, the viceroys are only apparent in Star Wars. Exactly. So
but I like the title anyway, so thank you. But I'm only vice chair.
And interestingly, Baby Yoda, not quite a baby. He's over 50 years old, or about 50 years old, as I understand it.
The little cutie baby doll?
Exactly.
He's that old?
His race is something that ages very, very slowly. So although he looks like a baby, he's actually quite old. So we're getting a bit off topic, but this is the, of course, year in review episode where we will each present 3 gifts to you, the listener, of some recaps of things that we think sort of defined or are important for the year 2019.
Yes.
And so shall we hop right into it?
I think you should start because it turns out that the regular thing would be you would present the overall stats, the overall trends from the various social media platforms, if they have made those statements public, which may not be the case at this point, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we should note that this is actually take 2 of the year in review. We recorded a first edition and tried to hook it up with a Facebook Live and everything, and ended up corrupting the audio file in the process. So we're re-recording. Element of surprise in some cases is lost, but hopefully we'll make for a sharper episode. So moving on to the first gift, it is a collection of year in review stats from the various social media platforms. Interestingly, Facebook this year not represented. They did not post a year in review. Even, we recorded first.
Are they late? I mean, I wanted to say that they tend to post by around Christmas, before Christmas, maybe the week before Christmas, if I remember from previous versions of this year in review.
Yeah, so I checked, and they usually post their year in review stats on December 10th or 11th, and our first recording of this was on December 15th, and they hadn't posted it, so I thought they were late. But now here we are on December 21st, and still no year in review stats. So I don't know what's going on with Facebook, but I have some ideas about maybe why they're not.
You mean that they will not actually disclose it whatsoever? It's not a question of delay; it's a question of permanently not.
I mean, they only have a few days left to do so, so maybe they're waiting towards the end of the year. But I think maybe they're just trying to keep a low profile. Would be my guess.
Could be not so entirely unwise.
So let's move on then to Twitter, which did post their what's happened or what's happening 2019, and we have a new record for the most retweeted tweet. It's actually
I remember from last time. If my memory serves me well, it must be the chicken nugget guy, or the chicken nugget tweet rather. That was absolutely the most retweeted tweet of all times.
But it has been broken. In January this year, the Wendy's Nuggets guy with the second most tweet has been beaten by Yazuka Maezawa, who is the founder of Japan's largest online retailer, ZozoTown. I didn't know who this guy was until I read that he's the guy who will be going to space with Elon Musk in 2023.
That's the only thing I would know about him, but I do know about that feat
So,
planned.
so he got 4.4 million retweets by promising to give 100 million yen, which is roughly about $1 million split among 100 people who retweet the tweet and follow the account. So a chance to actually win money from a millionaire, billionaire.
Was the tweet in Japanese?
The tweet was in Japanese, and we see a lot of Japanese activity on Twitter, which is quite interesting.
So this, in a sense, was very interesting because the other one was in English. So everyone, and Wendy is a transnational chain, food supplier, right? So people from around the world would maybe be interested in participating, where this is much more niche and nevertheless broke the record.
Right. And it's quite interesting. I think fast food, social media, especially fast food Twitter, is a thing. So we have the Wendy's Nuggets guy.
We also have the other thing, the
Popeyes chicken sandwich.
Exactly. And, the sensation.
Which, so actually we should mention to the listeners that I'm here in New Orleans. You are in Lund.
I'm in Sweden.
So I was here at home in New Orleans earlier in the summer, where Louisiana Popeyes chicken is kind of a thing. And yeah, the spicy chicken sandwich, I had to drive to 3 different Popeyes. I mean, lines were out the door. They sold out of chicken sandwiches nationwide. But
nationwide?
So many retweets for fast food Twitter. But this particular tweet, the Yazuka's Japanese tweet, was to give thanks for ZozoTown, his retail company's New Year's sale, for reaching 10 million yen in the fastest pace ever. So it has to do, it's actually from January. And what's interesting, he wrote—
From January of 2019?
From January. So it's way back in the year in review. He wrote about it. He said this: "I think that what everyone wants is a dream, not the money. If you have 1 million yen, you want to use it for something like friends, family members, society, and animals. This makes me want to cry because the use is aimed at things other than yourselves. Japan, you're not half bad. You have many dreams."
Oh, that's very beautiful, bordering on poetic.
Yes, and but I think this was before he gave the money. I don't know how he got this. I think it's a PR thing, but it worked, and it was the most retweeted tweet with 4.4 million retweets, beating Wendy's Chicken Nugget guy with 3.8 million, and Ellen DeGeneres' Oscars tweet with 2.3 million retweets.
Which is, again, I think we can notice that a lot of these very successful retweets are incentivized by some form of gain, financial or food-wise, So it's kind of interesting that if you want to get something trending, you have to include some reward. Maybe the generous tweet is an exception, but the most retweeted top 1 and 2 seem to be connected with some form of financial benefit or some personal benefit.
Definitely. And Twitter in their report actually said that we're not going to include this as the most retweeted tweet because it's connected to money, but they did make a note.
Sweepstakes.
Exactly. And it, from the political angle, it reminds me of these political prize giveaways, especially with our episode with Thomas Peters, who was developing the campaign organizing apps, where they would give Star Wars tickets, apropos, or during Brexit, a signed poster from Boris Johnson to encourage online action. And he said that was, even just 10 tickets, which cost the campaign very little, can inspire a lot of activity. So there is a little bit of a political connection there. But
and
in this
also
case,
like merchandise, right? Like I think this is something that a lot of bands do, and I think Trump would do with the MAGA hats. So I think it's interesting to see how, again, and maybe we'll get back to this idea kind of later in the podcast, that the online and offline are somewhat connected. So you're very active online to get an offline material benefit.
Definitely. I mean, this is kind of gamification to an extent. I mean, you and me both do Google reviews for nothing but points. So,
well, level 7.
Level 7. There it is. All right. So moving on to the top news-related hashtags by the number of unique users that use them or discuss them is number 1 was hashtag Notre Dame for when the cathedral in Paris was burning. Number 2 was something in Japanese related to the start of the Reiwa era. This is, Reiwa era. That's a new emperor in Japan. I guess every Japanese emperor has an era associated with it. Number 3 was Venezuela, Brexit, Typhoon Hagibis, which was also a Japanese natural disaster. Hashtag pray for Amazonia in relation to the wildfires. Hong Kong, climate strike. Christchurch in relating to the killing there, and hashtag Dem debate. So I think overall, a lot of disasters, polarized politics, protests, and again,
Japan.
and Japan. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. The Japanese Twitter users are really
Maybe it's
picking up.
so that on in Japan, Twitter is the preferred social medium compared to Facebook, for example, or some other national chat applications. I remember we talked about this maybe 1 or 2 years ago, that they had their own equivalent to
Line.
WhatsApp, exactly.
Yeah.
But it seems that the Twitter has been also driving quite a lot of their attention. So it's interesting to see how this varies nationally. But it's interesting also that it's kind of breaking the monopoly of Western communication, and
Definitely.
maybe that's something to watch out for.
Definitely. And there's a couple other platforms with high Japanese use that I'll talk about in a second. Looking at the most retweeted tweets in terms of their comments that they generated. So I guess most commented tweets. And this is something that I completely missed on Twitter. It's these kind of phrases in different languages that, let's take the first example. O Jawa Kaeng. Do you know what that means?
And I have never seen it on my Twitter, and I have no idea, not even in which language this
It
is.
is apparently South African for what is eating you or what is bothering you. And someone tweeted this and it got over 65,000 comments. But this is
65,000 comments.
Yes. So
It's very interesting because South Africa has a lot of languages. It's like they speak Zulu, if I'm not mistaken, and Afrikaans and English, and yet some other languages. So this should be quite interesting if other people would understand this language.
Exactly. But it's grouped into these other, this group of 3 tweets that are kind of like this. And the second one is Scopa tu mana. Do you know what that means?
Not that either. And I don't know the language. I don't think it's the same as the first one, but I wouldn't know what it is.
No. So it actually probably doesn't mean anything at all. It is a viral phrase that was first coined by the Ghanaian musician Patapaa, who is legendary. Who is legendary for rapping gibberish lyrics. And it's believed that Scopa tu mana is believed not to have any real meaning, but Twitter users have just given it, what's your opinion on this, or what's your experience? And I think hopefully if our everything works, we will play a clip from the song so you can hear where it comes from.
Hear it in the original pronunciation.
In the original pronunciation. Just give me a second here to pull it up. All right, you should hear it around 5 seconds into this clip. Ready?
Play it.
So there it is, the viral Twitter phenomenon.
Hey, I want to see this song. It's a good, nice rhythms.
It's called Davi Neba, featuring Patapaa. Or maybe that's the artist. So the song is Kawula Biyov.
I think your Ghanaian dialects are improving as we speak.
Yes. So then there's a third one that was Bomba Clat. And
whoa, this again, yet another language. You're like, let me guess.
So this actually has a meaning. It is Jamaican, I believe it is, or some dialect from Jamaica. That it is actually an expletive for either menstrual pad or toilet paper. Interestingly, bumba, obviously meaning bum, or also vulva, and clot for cloth. So a bumbo clot is a menstrual cloth or toilet paper. And people...
Why is that trending? That sounds slightly odd.
They just gave them the same meaning. What's bothering you? And then a couple people later corrected the record of, hey, this is actually what it means.
That is kind of weird.
But yeah, so essentially you have this either real words or not that Twitter users are just giving meaning to about what's bothering you, and people just express what's what they think about something
But
in the
interesting that,
comments.
if I understand correctly, anyway, these are kind of questions with a little negative twist. Is that like not what's going on good in your life, but what is not exactly satisfying? What are you upset about? What is eating you? Right? You were saying that it means in translation. So maybe it's a mobilization. It has this mobilization effect because it plays on these negative feelings that apparently lots of people around the world have in 2019.
Exactly. And as a case in point, Lady Gaga, who tweeted just arg with a bunch of, numbers and letters, got over 284,000 comments. So
In
something with,
connection to nothing,
yeah,
simply just an expression.
exactly. And so I think it shows that, anger and the opportunity to express it on social media drives conversation, which is something we see also in the political space as well.
And that's connected also with a lot of other phenomena, right? Which probably we'll also discuss a little bit later in the podcast, like communicating feelings through other means, like memes or GIFs.
Definitely hot year for memes. But before we dive into that, top politicians worldwide discussed by unique users on Twitter. We have, of course, number one, Donald Trump, then Barack
How
Obama.
much?
It doesn't
Do
say.
we have a number? Doesn't say.
Doesn't say. Donald Trump, Barack Obama, Narendra Modi from India, AOC, which is interesting. I think she's actually the kind of lowest ranked politician, not a head of state, but ranking in at number 4 on the list. Bolsonaro from Brazil at 5, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Emmanuel Macron, I think the only European leader, and Vladimir Putin at number 10, who doesn't even have a Twitter account.
Interesting that he's trending. So it's all about mentions, people talking about him, not him talking so much, right?
Yeah, I was surprised to see Joko Widodo, if I have his name right, from Indonesia, not on the list. He's usually he has a large number of followers. Perhaps he wasn't just discussed.
Perhaps there was nothing so controversial. Maybe he didn't make any controversial statements or particular controversial politics. But again, this simply illustrates my lack of knowledge about Indonesian politics.
Exactly. So there was in the report there was some more stuff about most mentioned TV show, Game of Thrones, Avengers, that kind of thing. But that's it for political Twitter. Mostly disasters, kind of famous politicians. Interesting, Macron, the only European leader up there.
Interesting that there are not so many journalists or news media that would dominate this space, because traditionally we have looked at Twitter as a very media friendly, mass media friendly space in which journalists and news channels would have a very strong presence, as the immediacy and the breaking news reporting and this type of dynamics would be quite important. And since we had a lot of events, a lot of crises, including natural disasters, you would expect that a lot of these actors would be present, but apparently not so much.
Yeah, I mean, chicken sandwich really dominated for me this year. Again, which, by the way, I can highly recommend it. It is worth the
Popeye one.
The hype.
Did you actually get your hands in the end on one?
I did before they ran out, and it is absolutely.
You could
delicious.
certify that it's worth it
because they put pickles on it. I don't think Chick-fil-A does the pickles. So.
Oh, because this is a rivalry between Popeyes and the other food chain.
Well, Popeyes is famous for its fried chicken, but it's never actually had a chicken sandwich. So that was a big deal when it came out.
That is the deal. Again, yes. It's interesting, like with political competition, as with the trending hashtag Dem debate and so on, it's about competition and rivalry and first past the post or race or this type of almost conflictual settings that mobilizes attention and drives people to engage with things.
Right. And at the risk of talking about fried chicken too much, one of the reasons it blew up is because I think Chick-fil-A retweeted Popeyes, or Popeyes retweeted Chick-fil-A, so it was kind of a war between the official accounts, which is interesting and fun to follow. People were posting memes in the comments. I don't know why it didn't make the top year in review list.
Maybe because it was American based, since these two chains they're not active outside the US, I think.
That's true. That's true. Maybe they need to open up a Popeyes in Japan if they don't already. Exactly. Looking at the different platforms, Google had a kind of year in review video, which was about heroes. So they're kind of, or to be politically correct, sheroes as well. They had a video about kind of everyday heroes, showing people with disabilities, race activists, the Avengers, sports. So that was kind of
But that
their
was their own theme. That was the Google choice of
that
theme.
that was their kind of, yeah, what they said defined year 2019. I looked at the top searches. It was a lot of football matches, like Googling this team versus that team, but from kind of different. I hadn't heard of the sports clubs. Maybe they were from Africa or something like that. And the iPhone 11, kind of an interesting mix of things, but nothing too
Weird.
political in the top.
Which also has to remind us, I think, even, I don't know if this percentage still holds, but for a couple of years ago, I think somebody measured the percentage of politics very generally and broadly defined on Twitter. And I think it was something like 10 to 15%. And I think this reflects very much the reality, even to today, if we look at these trending hashtags, keywords, and searches that you just described.
And I think there was one study early on, maybe it's the same one you're referring to, where the biggest traffic online, and we see this also in the most visited websites, is porn. And we will get back to some Pornhub stats in a bit. But
that's why, digital communication is so interesting to study for any social scientist.
Indeed. So keeping within the Google universe, looking at YouTube, they produce a rewind video every year. I watched that to see if there was anything political, and not really. A lot of dance artists, creators. They had the top 10 most liked videos, and number 10 was one called Conspiracy Theories with Shane Dawson, which I thought was kind of ironic that conspiracy theories would make the list on YouTube, which...
but was it was it critical or like debunking, or was it propagating conspiracy theories?
It was weird. I tried to watch it to get a sense of what it was. It was like 2 hours long. It was essentially just presenting different conspiracy theories, not necessarily debunking them, but just kind of talking about them.
Describing them.
And so one, for example, which I thought was kind of interesting, was that all watches in ads are set at 10:10.
Like very symmetrical.
Very symmetrical. And I mean, I found some examples contrary to this, but the large majority of them are set to 10:10, which is super interesting. And so the kind
But is this a secret message, or simply more aesthetically symmetrical, balancing, pleasing?
So the conspiracy theory aspect of the whole thing is that it's a kind of, because it looks like a smile if you think about a watch at 10:10, and the idea is it's kind of a subconscious message that you'll be happy if you buy the watch, versus having a frown if it was at, what would that be, 7:20 or something like that.
It would be having like a mustache. It wouldn't necessarily be a frown. Anyway, I see where this conspiracy theories would take us, and I think we don't necessarily want to go too far down that road, as it's quite speculative. But interesting that was one of the popular videos on YouTube. Do you have any information which one was the number one?
It didn't necessarily say, but in terms of the most liked?
Most liked.
Oh, no, I don't remember. I mean, it was stuff like PewDiePie's wedding was really like number 2 or 3.
Classics. Again, I think in a sense also this type of established accounts tell the story that social media, YouTube in particular, but probably all of them, are no longer trending for the new and up and coming. It's very much established accounts, established politicians, maybe, for example, with the exception of AOC, but generally like a lot of established things. So very little surprises. It's almost defying the purpose. It's almost like they become a mainstream media in and of itself. These channels with their established creators, household names for respective platforms.
I just remembered another one of the conspiracy theories was something with Walt Disney being cryogenized, so frozen. So the movie Frozen was a way to distract people from searching Walt Disney when they went on Google.
Wow. I think it really is demanding quite a lot of imagination to come up with these conspiracy theories. But anyway.
That was YouTube, that was Google. So now moving on to Instagram, which has seen obviously a rise of users. I mean, such an explosive platform with all the marketing and everything going on there. Not so much politically, but is having its place. Did you see this whole thing about the world record egg?
I've seen the egg. It was almost impossible not to see it, but I didn't pay much attention to it, to be honest.
So I had to I missed this entirely as I'm off Instagram at the moment, which kind of funny side story. I deleted it while writing my thesis, and then you have the choice between disabling or deleting. and if you delete it, you can't bring it back. So
It's forever gone.
in the midst of saying I need to stop procrastinating, I deleted it, but now I'm too sheepish to make a new account and follow everyone back. But anyways, this actually happened in January when I did have an account. And so another thing that happened early in the year, but I mean, smashed all Instagram records with 54 million likes, the picture of just
54
an egg.
million. That's huge.
And
Almost
so,
everyone on Instagram liked it.
yes, and it was so, well, I mean, if you think about how many people
half
are on
of the people on
Instagram,
Instagram.
600 million, something like that. So
Yeah.
it's a pretty good number of people.
But why would they do that? Why would they like an egg?
It was something that had to do with, I think it was Kylie Jenner was having a baby, and this account, World Record Egg, posted a picture of an egg and said, "Let's beat Kylie Jenner," and just kind of.
Oh, it was another type of competition. Again, like we talked about Popeye and Chick-fil-A and so on and so forth. It seems that this drives people's interest and mobilizes also their engagement. So there should be always some form. Though no sweepstakes, but something about being the number one, being the most liked, and so on.
So this account, it had 54 million likes for this picture, but the account had 7.5 million followers. And what it would do is over time, it would post pictures of the egg starting to crack. So it had this huge following, everyone wondering, what is this egg? And one professional marketer claimed that the first brand to pop out of the egg would be worth about $10 million. So that's
because it has 54 million people's attention, or probably even more people that watched it but never engaged with the post. So
exactly.
So who did it?
Well, I will get to the big egg reveal. But first, the political aspect of this is that the anonymous owner of this account apparently pitched the idea to have an impeach Trump message coming out of the egg, with Trump doing a chicken dance. But apparently that didn't get picked up. But what did was that it cracked during the Super Bowl.
Very timely.
On February 4th, and it was revealed that the egg was a promotion for talkingegg.info, which was a website highlighting the mental health support or the mental health risks of social media. So the idea was that the egg cracked under the pressure of social media and encouraged viewers to talk to someone if they were struggling with that pressure as well.
Which is very nice. It's a noble cause. And if that was from the beginning, the campaign run from this NGO, then it is probably one of the cleverest campaigns in the history of social media.
Definitely. And the video of the egg coming out got 38 million views, and is very suited to Instagram, right? Pressure, social media, getting likes. We know Instagram's toying with removing likes from the platform. So I think this gets into some of these kind of tech addiction, pressure of social media that I don't think has kind of come to a head yet. So if I had to make a prediction, there will be more studies coming out and more pressure on these platforms about the long-term effects of all of this attention seeking.
Yeah, I think we're seeing more attention anyway to mental health issues. In Sweden as well, we had the death by suicide by one of the most famous singers and music persons altogether, Avicii, worldwide famous, and that his death also provoked a lot of discussion about mental health and how social media may be connected actually to the opposite of well-being.
Yeah, I believe it. There was a study a couple of years ago by, I think it was Common Sense, was the organization that showed that teenagers, younger people, on their phone for over 9 hours a day.
My God, it's almost like as long as they're awake, they're connected to their phone.
Yeah, scary. But other things on Instagram, the 10-year challenge. Take a picture of yourself after 10 years, which kind of shows social media being around for some time now. Beyonce's dance.
We'll get back to this because it's about the decade in review.
Exactly. Beyonce's dance challenge. The most followed account is National Geographic, which I thought might be connected to climate change.
I think it's mostly connected to the most amazing, beautiful, unique pictures that they take of spots. Their photographers are the best in the world. So I think it's simply a visual pleasure.
Do you follow that account?
Yes.
So you contribute to their most followed status.
Yes.
Most followed male soccer star Cristiano Ronaldo. Cristiano Ronaldo holds on the top spot, and a sort of recurring theme in the podcast, most followed female account, Ariana Grande knocks off Selena Gomez this year as the most followed female on
Selena.
Instagram.
Yes, again, competition drives mobilization when it comes to social media. I think this is the theme we see here in these trends.
So a little disappointing, but also expected that Instagram not having so much political news making it into the top trends.
Interesting that AOC, for example, who's very active on Instagram, was not trending there, but wasn't trending on Twitter. So probably the most likely politician to have been trending on Instagram, AOC, did not really make the cut, but nevertheless made it all the way to Twitter. Maybe because also of some form of cross-platform pollination there. But again, we don't know because we haven't looked quite at the data. But it wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, I think it has to do with how they actually divide their how they count their stats. So AOC was there because it was a top 10 politician list. I think if we would see that on Instagram, she would definitely, if not number one, be
definitely. Lots of other politicians are active on Instagram, including Narendra Modi, who's also very famous for Twitter presence, and Justin Trudeau, also pretty active on Instagram, also because he's quite photogenic, right? So people that have some form of visual appeal or campaigns that invest a lot in infographics tend to do well on the platform.
Photogenic, perhaps when he's not wearing brown face.
Oh God, yes, that scandal didn't affect too much his re-election, but anyway.
But definitely an interesting a moment from 2019. Moving on to Reddit, which is more of a news-oriented platform.
Then we should expect more politics.
Definitely, and they, in terms of counting their rankings, they do break that down into news. A 17% year-on-year increase in subscribers in the top 50 news communities. So Reddit kind of growing in that space. They mentioned the hashtag trash tag challenge. Again, kind of climate change. You take a picture of yourself cleaning up, or you take a before and after photo with a bunch of trash cans and everything you've collected. A lot about protests and political scandals were among the most discussed, with Robert Mueller hearings being number 1 and the current impeachment inquiry being number 3. Top news discussion communities: politics, world news, UK politics, and then Not the Onion. I'm not exactly sure what that subreddit is.
I think it's I've seen it not necessarily on Reddit, but also taken on Twitter. Is when reality beats The Onion, which is a comic newspaper.
So it's kind of
satire. This cannot
that's
possibly
not satire,
be true, but yes, it is true. It could have been made up, and then it would have been a great joke. But it is actually true, so it's both sad and funny.
Looking at some of the most discussed news topics: China, Russia, police, law enforcement, and then number 4, healthcare, and number 5, climate change. So kind of interesting geopolitical.
I'm also quite surprised, to be honest. I think we'll talk about this a little bit later in the podcast, but that Greta Thunberg was not among the most mentioned figures in any of these on any of these channels. And again, I guess it's difficult to place her whether she's politician or not in that Twitter classification, but I would have expected that she would have figured more prominently, because indeed she was quite active and quite visible in the media for all sorts of reasons, which we can discuss more. But I'm surprised that she did not appear as a certain flag holder for the climate change topic.
Yeah, also on Twitter, I think some of the platforms mentioned her, but she didn't seem to really make these top lists, which is quite interesting, because obviously she is generating a lot of activity.
A lot of attention, yes. Maybe that would be a success for her. Maybe she was very, very good at making the climate change more visible, the topic of climate change more visible, without drawing as much attention to her person, which is what she wanted to achieve. But maybe this is also because climate change is not just connected with Greta, but also with all these wildfires that you already discussed briefly, and that are currently ongoing in Australia now in their summer.
Yeah, all over the place. But we'll get back to Greta Thunberg a little bit later. Most discussed major events we already discussed 2 of them: the Robert Mueller hearings, Number 2, Nancy Pelosi's formal impeachment announcement. Number 3, Brexit. Number 4, also impeachment. And number 5, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, which was a big news discussion this year and still ongoing with Prince Andrew. And
yeah, I think it's in the how you call that, in the after effects of Me Too, right? So Jeffrey Epstein's scandalous life, his dramatic exit. There's also some conspiracy theories. Perhaps you've already become familiarized with that his death was not entirely suicidal, which
but
is
a cover
again
up for the rich elite.
a cover up, like he knew too much and he had to be eliminated. Mysteriously, videos disappeared and so on and so forth. But basically, I think Jeffrey Epstein's presence in these top most covered news and scandals has to do with the Me Too reverberations a year after.
And I have to play this just because this was one of the funniest things I saw on social media this year. Did you see this with the Walmart and Jeffrey Epstein?
No, I have not. Let's see it.
I will play it. So this is someone who went into Walmart and asked the person, you'll hear, if you lose someone in Walmart, you can go to the kind of reception front desk and ask them
exactly,
to page
like
a person.
kid is lost or something.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a video that someone took.
Good afternoon, Walmart customers. If I may have your attention, please. Will Mr. Clinton Epstein meet your party at the grocery entrance? Mr. Clinton Epstein, please go to grocery entrance to meet with your party. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me know if he doesn't show up like in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Then you can come back and I'll do it again.
Thank you.
That is the most, I mean, there are two things that are extremely hilarious. I must react. First of all, the actual idea, but probably even more hilarious is that the person, the actual employee, the Walmart employee, does not blink. Like she doesn't react. She doesn't, maybe she doesn't get it, but definitely she responds as if indeed that is an actual person that lost.
So this has got to be something that's been organized by some 4chan trolls or something along those lines. I haven't gone to see if it's been discussed there, but I saw it on Twitter and just cracked up.
Imagination. But definitely that's something that makes the Jeffrey Epstein story so discussing, because it's conspiratorial and it involves both the left and the right and even the British at this point. So apparently he was a man of many connections.
Indeed. So turning to most discussed presidential candidates leading into the 2020 election. Number 1, of course, Donald Trump. Number 2, Bernie Sanders, then Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and number 5, Kamala Harris, who is no longer in the race. But
so no Mayor Pete.
No Mayor Pete, probably because his name's too hard to spell.
I still don't know how to pronounce it.
Buttigieg.
I think he has like t-shirts where he like spells it out phonetically. But yeah, damn those Maltese, huh? They're not making it easy for the English speaker.
So that was Reddit, their year in review. And now moving on to a very interesting platform, Pornhub. I was going in.
Pornhub releases their stats.
Exactly. I was
very transparent.
Indeed, poking around in there, which is no pun intended. But actually, Pornhub has very, very interesting data insights teams, and they put out reports that are actually very, very fascinating to read. They have a lot of data, obviously, on where people are looking, what they're looking at, and that type of thing. So they have a top 10 list, and I think it's the reason I went looking at their year in review is because last year we saw a kind of political aspect of Stormy Daniels being searched during her 60 Minutes interview, which is kind of connected to a Trump scandal. And so kind of interesting. So I was poking around to see what was going on the platform this year, and there's not much politics unless you consider femdom as a female empowerment. That clocked in at number 10 as one of the searches that defined 2019.
I didn't even know what that meant. Obviously, I'm not a frequent user because I've seen this like a keyword, and I'm like, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I think it's women sort of humiliating men by dragging them around as slaves and stuff like that.
Maybe it's something I don't want to know. But anyway, it's maybe a part of this, the counter of Me Too.
Exactly.
Maybe it's connected to that.
And they mention that. They say, we see gender issues trending on other, female empowerment trending on other platforms. So it makes sense that it's also spilling over into Pornhub. Interestingly, amateur was the #1 search that defined 2019. I thought maybe that was linked to authenticity and social media. But TV events.
That was the most sought after.
Yeah, it's they don't really define how they make these metrics. This is kind of their 10 searches that define 2019. So it's not necessarily the most searched terms, but it's kind of what they think.
Defining for them. Maybe it was new compared to 2018, for example.
Exactly.
Or something like that.
So what's interesting is that they show how porn watching decreases during big TV events like the Emmys and the Oscars and things like that. Fun fact, during Eurovision, there was a 12% drop in Swedish traffic. It's big song contest.
It does work, huh? Just keep the people watching TV. They won't have time for anything else.
And for those interested, Ariana Grande does beat Selena Gomez in porn searches. Ariana Grande is #5, Selena Gomez #7. But where does this all get political and Pornhub as a whole report on this is porn traffic during the US government shutdown in January, which is interesting because a lot of people are out of work and they have time on their hands or with their hands, however you'd like to put it. What's interesting is that the US government shutdown increased traffic by 5.9% per day on average across the US. Watch time increased 33 seconds, and visits by women were up 4% nationally. But specifically in Washington, D.C., which is most affected by the
particularly
shutdown.
Affected, yeah.
Traffic increased 6.32%, and visits by women up by 12%. So 8% higher than the national average in terms of women's searches.
A lot of women employees at the federal government level.
So interesting that government shutdown has a spillover effect of increasing porn watch time, which makes sense. But they did say
it's always interesting to see it at alternative measurements of trends. For example, if you want to not necessarily make this very obvious connection, but look at some unexpected data, Pornhub views or geolocation, and connect that to explain some other phenomena. I think we talked at some point during this year how Strava, Strava, which is a application for those who run or bike, has been used to identify secret military bases by possible enemies of the United States, because most of the data is public. And if you see a lot of people running in circles or running in squares in the middle of Afghanistan, then probably you would look at a very safe identification of a military base. So I think it's interesting, and it's an interesting challenge also for researchers to discover new ways to get at data or to interpret data that normally is not political or is not connected to traditional ways to identify trends. So maybe Pornhub holds some secrets.
Definitely does. And kind of rounding it out and bringing things full circle and linking back to Twitter, a lot of searches for Japanese. I remember, so maybe that's people with a Japanese fetish or people from Japan, highly active in searching for their own. So that is what I have for the platform year in review. Unfortunately, no Facebook. We'll see if they come out before the end of the year. If they do, I'll be sure to tweet about it.
Very nice. And I think it ties very nicely to what I have as my first gift, if you're ready for it.
I'm ready.
Because I'm looking at maybe what has been proclaimed by many as the #1 app defining 2019, and that is TikTok.
Boom, boom.
Do you have an account on TikTok?
I opened one and I played around with it. It is hilarious, but so much of a time waster. I had to delete it.
That's precisely how I felt about it. I looked around and then I realized that this is too much of a temptation. Also, it's a little bit like it's kitschy on the border of too much kitschiness, and at the same time amusing and not very political. But what I think defines TikTok as the app of the year 2019 is the fact that it increased tremendously in the number of users of the app, despite the fact that this is a Chinese app. So I think for the first thing, or something that is very interesting to note, is that this particular app is the only one among the top social media platforms that is not US based. So it is owned by a Chinese company, and it is has national headquarters, or national ruling teams. So there's a TikTok US and a TikTok France and so on and so forth. But overall, it is owned by a Chinese company. Right? I'm just trying to find exactly the name, but I think you're correct. So they published also their year in reviews. Maybe this is a good way to start. They published something called the TikTok 100 that names the top videos, the top genres, and the creators that mark the platform. And it's nothing really super political about it. The most viral video included a science experiment conducted by a YouTube star. And again, you see there a little bit of
it was elephant toothpaste or something, wasn't it? I saw them pour some buckets and make a bunch of toothpaste. Kind of like a Mentos in the Coke.
Yes, it was connected to that. And continuing this theme, the second most popular was a man doing surgery on a banana. Yes, and a swimming pool stunt gone wrong. And again, I think we have seen that short snippet. Another trending thing, which may or may not again fit into this into more visible gender profiling, is something called Visco Girls. You have maybe also heard of this, which is a youth subculture of teens that proclaims like a normcore aesthetics and are quite environmentally minded, and are connected to an app that is very trending on Instagram that allows different filters.
Yeah, I use Visco. It's a solid filtering app.
Solid filtering app.
I'm not a Visco girl though. I can proclaim.
Well, yeah, I think your beard gives you away. But definitely, it's an interesting again combination between Instagram and TikTok. And again, not so much politics. And one of the interesting things that is worth mentioning is that TikTok does not the TikTok algorithm, or the way you become famous and popular on TikTok, is not by the number of followers or by the number of trending hashtags that you would accumulate. It's not the way it works. It's simply based on proprietary algorithm promotion. So you don't know if you're going to be trending or not. You can be an account that has almost no followers and nevertheless have a video that is seen by 10 million people. And the explanation is simply like you have to produce the right video at the right time, and that would basically be promoted by an artificial intelligence powered algorithm that identifies elements that are trending and relevant right now. So it's interesting that it kind of tests a different model of popularity, and again, we'll see if this holds into the future. I think it's also interesting to see that there's been a little bit of a scandal because of this Chinese aspect. Fears of censorship have been floated around, which again, the company has made everything to deny, in particular through the US spokesperson of the company. But again, it's not something that it's easily denied. There's been some attempts to use TikTok for politics. But again, we have to say from the very beginning that it's not a format that is very suitable for serious discussions. Again, I think most people who are there for entertainment purposes and for entertainment purposes alone. However, some traditional media channels have their own TikTok presence, and most famous of all probably is the Washington Post, very traditional newspaper, who posted a very interesting video, which we can watch right now.
Yes, it is. Do you want to give a little context as to what we're seeing?
We're seeing one of the Democratic presidential wannabes Senator Cory Booker filmed on a 12-second video running through the airport and pushing the Washington Post TikTok reporter Dave Jorgensen on the ground while screaming, Cory Booker 2020.
Let's watch
and
it.
On the soundtrack of a very appropriate music.
Indeed.
Booker 2020.
Thank you for your cooperation.
It is funny, and I think it works very nicely. It also makes reference to Booker's professional football career, or at least in college years football career. The fact that he's quite fit and takes down the unknowing reporter.
What I like about it, and I didn't catch it the first time, but when you shared this with me, I was doing a bit of reading on it, and it's timed so that when he knocks over the reporter, someone comes on the loudspeaker from the airport and says, "Thank you for your cooperation," because they timed it. They timed it right at 7 p.m., which is kind of that's kind of, I think, the TikTok part, right? There's always, I guess, to go viral, there needs to be this kind of extra element that's really planned. I mean, people spend a lot of time, I think, putting these videos together.
Yes, and actually there were some other attempts to use TikTok politically because their demographics is very, very specific. It's teenagers, and I think the upper age limit is about 24. So we've seen it used in the British general election campaign of 2019, elections that just ended, 2 weeks ago or so, and their teenagers produced homemade campaign videos, mobilizing videos, trying to get out their peers to vote either in general or to support a certain political party. And they were TikTok videos are very short, so they were quite having this homemade feeling. At the same time, they carried this authenticity with them, and I think that made them quite popular. I don't think we have the time to play any videos, but there were several attempts from British teenagers to mobilize others politically. And maybe finally, and probably the most controversial so far, TikTok political involvement had to do with a video that went viral with a Chinese Uyghur person, a girl that started with curling her eyelashes and talking about makeup, and then switching briefly topics and beginning to discuss the oppression of the Chinese government by the Chinese government of the Uyghur minority. So
yeah, and that was interesting because I checked some of the stats. I mean, that was all over the mass media, and I wonder to what extent that increase the view rate of the video. But that one, I checked the stats on it, had 860,000 likes. And looking a bit at what TikTok had put out, their top 10, the number 10 video in the beauty and style category had 1.1 million. So about a difference. It almost made the cut of top beauty and style videos. I don't know if TikTok would have included it with its Chinese ownership.
I think it's also a lot of these things that we don't quite know how they are working, because again, we have this Chinese connection, and we know that outside the TikTok space, the Chinese government actively censors the digital content available to Chinese users, at least. So I think, again, these are a lot of unknowns, but it just I wanted basically to put TikTok on the map and say that while it doesn't have an obvious political connotation, it can fall into the same line as Snapchat, as it once used to be, or as Vines that preceded it in connection to Twitter. These small entertaining videos, 10, 12, 15 second long, that can communicate maybe in an authentic and immediate way, and in a humorous way, some form of political message.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on what you were saying about the British elections and the video of the Labour supporter doing the shimmy.
A little dance.
It reminded me a lot. I remember I had seen in the 2017 British election, I want to say, or 2015, I saw the first kind of political snap of two girls who, and also in connection with the Labour Party, taking a picture saying, just registering to vote for the first time. And, at that time, and it's interesting to kind of put things in perspective, Snapchat was seen as, being able to displace Facebook. And there's a lot of discussion about TikTok being able to displace Facebook. And I think what's important to keep in mind is that we saw this huge rise in Snapchat and all this discussion, and then it fell.
Kind of flop. I think it still goes strong in terms of economic performance, and Snapchat has not disappeared, but it's definitely losing a lot of the market space. Also because some of its features have been very much copied by others, which is again something that I'll get back to a little bit later on in the pod.
Yes, and I think it's, or I've seen Snapchat doing a lot of positive things around registering young voters. So they're still in the game, and they're still doing a lot of positive stuff in terms of voter registration. But yeah, their user base isn't quite growing.
No, I think it's interesting generally that we see this trend of non-political apps, not news-related apps that nevertheless have political uses, which simply say that politics is everywhere where people are, and we cannot isolate politics from non-politics. Spotify, for example, is a music streaming service that has no obvious political uses, but very recently, I think both of us were present at the EuropeCom conference, the European institutions launched their very first united Spotify music channel, which is supposed to send the thematic playlists of European music. So again, it's not something that you would expect from a public institution to have a music channel on a digital streaming app, but nevertheless, they thought it was strategic enough to be present there. So it was launched with quite a lot of brouhaha. Maybe the same is going to be for TikTok. Maybe it's the same for Snapchat or for some other apps of the future.
Indeed. Yeah, TikTok, definitely interesting space to watch. Should we turn over to a couple of the listener questions?
Yes, we had a very interesting selection of questions from various listeners.
Thank you all for submitting your questions. We'll take a few of them as we kind of go along through the episode. Perhaps we should start with Tom's.
Yes.
Which has to do with the European Parliament elections.
Exactly. What is your assessment of the use of social media in the EU elections? Was this time I'm voting the great success is touted as? How about the political groups in the EP? How did they do? Again, this kind of ties in with what I was saying before about the European Union's Spotify account, right? So I think the strategy of the European institutions has been to kind of use more data and be more aware of where their users are. And so again, both of us have looked a little bit at Twitter data collected around the European elections that took place in May 2019. And I think what we can see looking at that Twitter data is that indeed the hashtag This Time I'm Voting was present not only overall as one of the top hashtags of the campaign, but also in translation in different language clusters around Europe. So this was a national point of discussion for various commentary surrounding the election. So in a sense, you can say that that was already a success. Also, they made a YouTube video or a social media video that maybe you have some more info on. That was anyway something that the European Parliament was very proud to have been behind.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the video and the kind of overall success of the campaign in the next episode, the first episode of the new year. So I'll kind of hold off on that. But I think, I mean, it was a success in terms of generating a lot of attention. I think the campaign overall, I think Brexit had quite a bit to do with that as well. I want to focus in on the data we looked at and the particular hashtag, what was it? Hashtag Future of Europe, I think it was, that was connected to the debate, the Spitzenkandidaten debate, which we counted somewhere in the ballpark of 10,000 tweets around one of the major debates that was going on during the European Parliament elections. So, and normally we see debates as big spikes in activity with things like dual screening. And yeah, I don't think 10,000 is quite a super success. when it
No, and
comes
this
to
is,
European
I think you're
politics.
right. And I think it has to do with the fact that that debate was not picked up by national television channels, like by the public broadcasters across Europe in real time. And so it was quite marginal from the point of view of national television, and that reduced the potential audience of that debate. I think it was definitely live streamed on Facebook and all the social media channels of the European institutions, but that audience is necessarily smaller compared to the television audience. And the fact that the two audiences did not overlap, there was no double screening, or at least reduced double screening, and that would explain the low number. But altogether, I think that to respond directly to Dom's question, I think that the social media campaign during the elections, or in favor of getting out a vote, was more effective this time than any other time before. And I think it did have to do with a little bit of a changed approach, focusing on micro influencer, getting volunteers on the ground in various European states to represent the political message of the European Parliament, which was non-ideological but oriented towards, again, getting out the vote, mobilizing the interest of citizens in the European cause, and explaining why it is important for Europeans to actually vote, not only nationally but also at the European level. So I think overall they should be quite satisfied with their performance. I think that the fact we had for the first time a little bit of a upswing in terms of voter turnout cannot be entirely associated with the social media campaign. I think, as you mentioned, Brexit had quite a lot to do with the increased visibility of the European issues. At the same time, I think that the campaign strategy has used the Brexit momentum in their favor. So I think altogether, this gets definitely a big applause from social media campaigners.
And I just want to focus on the second part of Tom's question. How did the political groups in the EP do? And we haven't looked at the data, but there was some interesting, I don't want to use the word interference, but there was a bit of a hiccup with Facebook introducing new policies around their micro-targeting and their use of ads, where in order to run an ad, you had to have an entity registered in every member state you wanted to run an ad in. So if you're a European political group or the parliament itself, you had to have registered in 28 different countries. They rolled this out between 6 and 8 weeks before the election. So it caused a huge kind of
uproar
stress, yeah, for the campaigns. But also we talked about it with Alexandra Kellenkamp in one of our previous episodes, that basically the argument from the campaigner side is that Facebook doesn't understand how the EU works, and it's sort of they really miscalculated putting in this policy.
At the same time, I must say, I'm no defender of Facebook per se, but in this case, I think their policy simply illustrated the lack of harmonization of European member states' campaign laws. So it is really not Facebook's fault in this particular case. This made apparent the lack of harmonization when campaigners felt it, and which was something that they were maybe only latently aware of before. But it is actually, touching a very sensitive political issue that the Commission did not want to touch and the member states did not want to touch, namely the desire by many to harmonize how the European election campaigns across the 27, 28 member states must take place. Now it's a matter of national decision making and national laws, which are historically very divergent. And so Facebook had to respect the national laws and thus had to provide different parameters to different campaigners depending on where they were based. So it's not Facebook this time, but it's actually the lack of harmonization in Europe that was behind this particular problem. Of course, the timing was wrong, but beyond that, I think it's also policy.
Yeah, and it should be noted that they actually suspended that policy until the elections were over. So
they were flexible enough to, and they were given guarantees that the government will not pursue them, right?
But I've talked to people that this hurts NGOs in terms of their, because they partner with across boundaries, and we'll talk about this again in our next episode.
I think it simply shows the limits of Europeanization. And again, this is a topic that I could definitely expand quite a lot. It's close to my research interest, but it simply shows that despite the fact that social media is a borderless space and that there are all sorts of circumstances propitious for integration of a political space in a digital sphere, these various digital regulations nevertheless create borders in the virtual communication arena. So we're not as integrated in Europe as perhaps we would think.
Yes.
And with this, I think we answered Tom's question.
Definitely. And I just want to take one from Ben, who sent us a bunch of questions. Thank you, Ben. This one ties in also with EU politics. He's asking, how prevalent is Russian influence on EU debates on social media? Any figures on the number of bots, et cetera? Again, we'll also talk about this next episode, but not so much disinformation during the European Parliament elections. It was also, if we kind of think back, that was a huge test at the time to see whether there would be or not. Turns out not so much. No figures on the bots, et cetera. But looking at our Twitter data, one of the things we see is a lot of bots spamming porn, particularly interracial porn, which is quite interesting. And also at the EuropeCom conference, they had some people basically spamming the conference hashtag with some phalluses or phalli, and
which is again using any kind of trending hashtag to promote some form of illegal or borderline illegal content.
Hashtag hijacking.
Exactly.
And it was funny. I just wanted to note that the one of our listeners, thank you, mentioned, because the official social media and politics bot was retweeting that hashtag and thus retweeting all of those penises as well.
Jeez. So. Yes. Apropos bots can really be quite dangerous if left out of control. But I think generally, and again, we'll talk a little bit about this in the context of disinformation, the Russian influence is less apparent in Europe compared to the United States. Among other things, also because of the regulation that the European various member states have about political campaigning.
And interestingly, differs according to different areas. From the episode with Dr. Bente Kalsnes, she was saying in Norway, there's not so much Russian disinformation compared to Sweden or Finland, where there's more kind of pressure on NATO and influencing the views of those countries, but not really Norway. So it's
a complicated matter, really. I don't think there's an easy answer to the Russian influence, and it carries very many faces, and not so often, I think, bots or are the preferred way to do it. I think trolls, if we are really to use one of these metaphorical behaviors, are more prevalent and more effective probably than bots. But anyway, that's a topic that perhaps is too broad for digging into right now.
So thank you for the questions. We'll pick up a couple more as we move along in between our gifts. Shall we move on to the second gift, or the third gift, my second?
Yes, exactly. What do you have in store?
So my second gift is broadly under the umbrella term generations, and generations referring to the different kind of segmentation of the population into Gen Z, Gen X, millennials, boomers. We'll get into the boomers a bit later. But I think we've really seen a politicization, if you will, of generations, particularly pitting younger generations against older generations. And we see this also in how people vote, right? Brexit, the recent British election, kind of really split along older people being more conservative, younger people being more to the left. And I'll come back to that, but I think we can't discuss generations and, of course, 2019 without the tremendous rise of Greta Thunberg, which is Swedish, of course. And as you being a Swede, I was wondering if you could just pronounce for the listeners the correct, how to actually pronounce Greta's name.
You've done a pretty good job, but the official way to say it is Greta Thunberg. So not a hard G at the end, but a soft G.
And I was surprised you had told me that Thunberg doesn't actually mean anything in Swedish.
It doesn't mean anything, really. No, it is most Swedish names connect with nature, but they doesn't translate into something.
Connected to nature. That's interesting.
Yes. It goes back to the first establishment of the state when they wanted to have last names that bringing the families together, not changing after the father. It's a complicated story, but it helped the Swedish state to develop better tools to tax families, to have stable last names that do not change by saying the son of someone, but by being the same name through the generations.
Did not know that.
Yes, exactly. But otherwise, it would be like in Iceland, like I don't know. I would be like I don't know, Anna Maria Niklasdottir.
Yeah,
right?
always the daughter.
The daughter, if I'm a girl, or if I were a boy, I would be I don't know, George George Niklasson. And if I had a child, then the child would have the name of the father, and so on and so forth. But like this, I would have my last name, and that would be stable, and the state would be able to locate where I am, where my family is, how much income we earn, and how much we owe to the state. Which is the reason why. And then people were asked to freely choose their names. And a lot of Swedes were inspired to choose nature-related names. So a majority of the not son names are natural inspired. They can be leaves and branches and islands and streams and mountains, for example. So
yeah,
that's
which
a side
captures
story.
the national consciousness.
Exactly.
Greta, I think she hints at the potential for Gen Z to really enact change, but also very much empowered by social media. And we've seen this also in the Parkland shootings in Florida, which I think were 2018, but nevertheless, young activists taking to social media and really getting a national platform and a wide following. I'm really just puzzled by the amount of controversy that this teenager brings about. And, you know, my kind of personal take is that I don't have a problem with Greta per se, but I'm very interested in the societal response.
Yeah, of course.
To
I think this is the interesting part, the fact that she's so provocative. She's provocative. She's very different. She's very radical in her discourse and her actions. And I think, in a sense, that's needed. I think apropos generations, I think the generation that she represents, the teenagers, the not even yet able to vote people, are in a sense pushed to be very radical because they have a sense of emergency and they cannot express that desire for political change to the regular channels because they cannot vote, right? So they need to take to social media, they need to take to the streets, to extra parliamentary politics, in order to provoke a sort of raised awareness for the hard issues that they're interested in. So I think this is what Greta has been very successful at doing, but at a great cost to herself. Obviously, it's very disruptive.
And I mean, who wouldn't, you know, take the opportunity to do all the amazing things she's done? But my problem with society's reaction is that, in a sense, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, but I really don't think that we should be celebrating skipping school. That's my personal take. I think stay in school, don't do drugs, go on, do great things. Of course, Greta is an exception, but I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I think actually I've been thinking about it because it's not the first time I hear you of this opinion, and with which I disagree to the extent that basically the argument is you need extra parliamentary politics. Extra parliamentary politics cannot be polite. It doesn't have any effect. It defeats the purpose of extra parliamentary politics if nothing happens. If people go to school and they take good grades and they learn about the science and then they go on to join the system. This is an anti-systemic critique from the point of view of these activists. The system is not providing them with the correct outcomes. And again, because they are so young, they're not allowed to vote. So they cannot, for example, back an anti-systemic party or a revolutionary party or a party that truly embraces their attitude. And I think this is a very clever, in that sense, campaigning strategy. It's a provocative strategy that can be done by one person alone or by several people together. And I think, again, she never asked to, she asked, but she never pushed anyone to join her. It's simply by example. She led by example, which I think brings her to this point of reference. I do agree, though, that the controversy around her person is distracting from the main point of view, that her main message. And I think this is when questions of authenticity, questions of her social status and so on also come in and distract from the climate issues that she's promoting.
And I'll fall into that category, but at the same time, I do think it's somewhat dangerous is too strongly said, but I don't think it's necessarily right to celebrate the skipping of school. And I think if we look at kind of what's happening, I mean, again, she is doing great things, but when we sort of take that on a encourage children to miss school, I don't like it. It's committing truancy, which so for our non-English, non-native English speakers, truancy is basically a fancy word for skipping school. And I kind of dug into it, and according to Sveriges Radio, so a big broadcaster in Sweden, children in Sweden are required to go to school between the ages of 7 and 16. Greta being 16, and municipalities have the power to fine parents of truant children since the 1980s, but it's rarely enforced. And I think the general fine is about $1,200. Just
to really capture this is like this. The forests are burning. Your school is about to burn. You're not going to go to school. This is what's happening in Australia right now. This is what happened in California some earlier in the year, and in so many other places, including in the northern part of Sweden, which is a country that normally doesn't have any fires because it rains most of the time, right? So when you have this type of extreme situations, an natural emergency situation, then obviously this traditional desire to conform and go to school, be a good girl or a good boy, don't resonate with this public. If your school is burning, you have no school to go. So I think this is where the message becomes so powerful, because it comes in connection with real life events that other people can also relate to. For example, these fires.
Right. And I know you already heard this comparison in the first take of our year in review, but I thought of this comparison when thinking of it, and that is comparing Greta Thunberg to artificial intelligence, with artificial intelligence being the idea that computers will often take steps that humans don't necessarily predict, and as a smarter way to meet an outcome. So we see this in the classic game of Go, where when a computer is trained trains itself the rules of the game and plays a grand champion, it famously made a move that no human had ever made, and it looked like the machine messed up, but actually turned out 5 moves later to beat the grand champion. And so the comparison with Greta and AI is that, and we've seen this also with David Hogg from the Parkland shootings. He's now going on to Harvard because he's a famous activist. I think the same thing with Greta. She can go to any school she wants at the university level, any type of Ivy League institution, by actually skipping school. And I think that's an interesting step we wouldn't think classically, but she'll get there.
She's skipping school, but is not skipping education, which is the other thing. She's not present in school, but she is actually learning. She's following the courses, and she is doing her homework, just not in school. And I think this is the difference, right? This is the kind of rebellion that is within the boundaries of what is expected of society. Like Japanese in the 80s, they used to go to work but have like protest headbands, and this type of idea is like, I'm doing my work, I'm just showing you that I really disagree with whatever you're doing, and in this case you is the governments of respective countries. And that which I think is interesting is that Greta Thunberg is not a person, it's a chain of reactions, and it represents, this is a phenomenon that it goes beyond the person. It's about a generation, going back to your point. And I think really we are seeing generations in terms of their social media use. I think there's definitely difference between Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z. Definitely.
And that will bring, this is kind of a two-parter. So apart from Greta Thunberg as kind of a defining figure in this generational gap, there's also the emergence of this meme phrase, okay, boomer. And I'll
which
talk
I think
a little.
It's funny. It's kind of cute, but also a little bit offensive, right?
It is, and then so I dug a bit into the origins of this, and actually, it is not from 2019. The first known appearance of OK Boomer is actually from 4chan back in 2015.
Wow, this is old.
And it was later seen on Reddit in 2017, and really got popular on Twitter 2018, but really we've seen it memeified, particularly with the Doge dog, which used to be with the kind of non-PC phrase "okay retard," it's been reappropriated to "okay boomer," and you'll see that in comment fields on Twitter, just people spamming memes and gifs of this "okay boomer" dog, which is quite funny. So of course the term is meant to kind of discredit older people as being out of touch or traditional, old-fashioned, whatever it might be, and has really become a slogan for Gen Z to sort of, in a way, kind of be quite discrediting or militant towards older generations. For example, their actions on climate change and policies around rising
Too
social
little, too
inequality.
late. The type of attitude they've been criticized for.
And so where this really got big was towards the later part of this year, where there was a song remixed on SoundCloud. Have you heard it?
Probably some bits of it, but not the full song. No.
Let's play it briefly for the listeners. I think if you're on TikTok, you'll have
this again, where everything fits together.
Exactly. Let's pull it up. I'll just play about 10-15 seconds of it.
Ayo, hey, yeah. This one goes out to all the 65 plus crowd on SoundCloud. Not gonna say much. Shout out Jed Will. He gonna take over on the mic. Old ladies suck. Okay, boomer. Okay, boomer. Okay, boomer.
Oh, this is ageism. Ageism at its worst.
Indeed. And so that went kind of viral on TikTok, with people, when the "okay boomer" kicks in, is when they're kind of making fun of old people. And then it even got into the political arena with a New Zealand member of parliament shouting down someone about climate change with an "okay boomer."
Did she actually say that in the parliament?
She did. And we have a clip once it loads. Give me 1 second here. So you can't hear what the heckler says, but let's see.
Boomer. Current political... Year 2050, I will be 56 years old. Yet, right now, the average age of this 52nd Parliament is 49 years old. Okay, Boomer. Current...
So, yes, it has made it into the official transcripts of the New Zealand Parliament, I'm sure. Okay.
I think it's very interesting, actually, beyond this phrase itself, apropos, again, generations, that we see this in politics. And going back a little bit to the Democratic presidential field right now, I think we see this in the persons of Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg. Yes, Pete Buttigieg. I think I made it this time. Who both are very centrist in their appeal, have policies that are quite in the same vein, at least the middle of the road, appealing to both moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats. But what defines them is like one is the oldest and the other one is the absolute youngest. And I think there are two kinds of energies, and people that, whatever I've heard being discussed in the media about them, people who like these ideas are split, whether they should vote for the experienced but very old person, or they should put their money with a young guy that doesn't have a lot of leadership experience, but that has a lot of energy and gusto and is driven by the ideas behind these policies. So I think we see that this tension, generational tension, even in the particular example of the Democratic presidential race. And I'm not sure how it will turn out. I mean, polls always put Joe Biden at the top, but I reserve my right to be skeptical about the polls until the very last minute.
Definitely. I think it'll be interesting to see how Iowa turns out. Buttigieg is polling quite
He's
well.
Still number one, right? At the moment.
1, 2. Could be a repeat. That's how Obama got big, right? He won Iowa unexpectedly, and then the rest is history.
Again, the Iowans were also discussing introducing some form of proportional representation, so not all votes being given to the first candidate, but being distributed according to the proportion of votes they got. So lots of things that could be happening there. Beyond the speculation about this particular case, I think we definitely see generational issues and generational attitudes, and maybe a split. Also looking at the Brexit vote and the general elections that recently ended, we could see again a very clear age divide between the youth 18 to 24 that voted up to 70% in favor of Labour, and that's for another version of Brexit than the one offered by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and those who were 65 and older who voted overwhelmingly also in the 70% percentile in favor of the Tory government. So I think age is really a very important factor in politics, and social media with these different demographics can play very nicely into differentiating generations in micro-targeting.
And I wanted to look and see kind of what would be the effects, how do old people or boomers feel about this. And there's a new study out in the Journal of Psychology and Aging, which suggests that okay, boomer might be bad news for boomers, which is they were measuring a bunch of different types of defensive narcissism, and in particularly hypersensitivity.
What is concepts?
Hypersensitivity is measured by asking people questions, things like, are you thin-skinned? Are you sensitive to criticism? Are you concerned with your own adequacy as a person? And what they found is that, kind of unsurprisingly, this hypersensitivity decreases as you age, and autonomy rises. So you become more sure of yourself the more older you are. But what's interesting is they found in the kind of one of the largest scale studies of its type is that boomers, or people born earlier in the century, start off with higher levels of hypersensitivity compared to younger people, which kind of goes against the general idea that Gen Z is so...
They take okay boomer to heart.
Exactly. So even though older people are less hypersensitive, it appears from this study that boomers, when they were born, started with higher levels of hypersensitivity than later generations.
Yes, I want to say one final thing on this generation, then we can move on to my gift, you know. But I was recently at a conference in Sweden called the Internet Days, Internetdagarna, and there also the topic of generation was very much present. So again, I think you are reading into a general trend that also marketers, not only political marketers, are concerned. And one of the speakers was saying that if you want to mobilize for a certain cause, or if you're a brand and you want to attract attention to your product, you have to really divide your message into age audiences. Generation X is very much interested in facts. Generation Y, which is the millennial generation, is very narcissistic, and they are very focused on in which way they can affect that policy, in which way this can be good for them, or in which way this empowers them as a person. And Generation Z, Greta Thunberg's generation, is the together generation. They're very much interested in cooperation, moving together, and messages that bring that kind of everybody does this, let's do it together clang that would mobilize their interest both politically and in terms of brand recognition and activity. So it's interesting that we see this division.
Yeah, and we also see brands, I think, this could have been a potential gift, is just moving towards this very marketing values along with their products. Really, there's a
you mean
example,
corporate social responsibility, something along these lines?
Something along those lines, where, like, pizza companies their advertisements are about, breaking down walls of division. It's like pizza bringing people together. I think we talked about it on an episode at some point. Maybe it was last year's Year in Review. It's just kind of, I don't know how that fits in with pizza.
Again, at this conference, we saw a whole commercial campaign driven by a coffee that you like quite a lot. At least I've seen you drink
Zoegas.
Not only Zoe, but Löfbergs Lila, the one that is. So they have a huge social corporate responsibility campaign in which they are focused very much on environmental responsibility, the way they source their coffee beans, the fair trade for the farmers that produce that, and all these things, but also raising questions of gender equality. They sponsor a hockey team in the middle of Sweden, and they have initiated all sorts of dialogues about toxic masculinity and violence on the hockey arena, and so on and so forth. So I think that raised definitely their profile among the youth This was perceived before as the type of coffee you drink at bingo parties, so definitely a boomer generation friendly. And now with this type of social corporate responsibility campaign and message, it reached into the much younger generations, also with the help of social media influencers.
And
so definitely we see that happening for sure.
And it's interesting. I mean, one of the podcaster I listened to is talking about like Subaru. So Subaru has all of these commercials for their cars, like feel good, love, blah, blah. And then they also make attack helicopters, but they don't talk about that as well.
Yeah,
so
of course. I mean, how much honesty can we expect, right? They say this is totally different division. We don't do that. The Subaru cars doesn't do Subaru helicopters. It's like a totally different company.
Yeah.
Which brings me a little bit to my gift, if you're ready for it.
Let's hear it.
And you think in which way what I'm going to say is related to Subaru 1 and Subaru 2, but you will see, because I'm talking about something that has been almost like a trend for me, which is on this podcast, namely regulation, but a different take on regulation this year. I'm bringing something new, a new gift, which is digital taxation. And it is very, very niche topic and not very exciting. So I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I wanted to, again, to put it on the agenda because it's something that's definitely on the radar of politicians, regulators in Europe, but also outside the European space. What is digital taxation? Digital taxation is an attempt to reform the tax laws of national countries and potentially of the European Union in order to tax digital services. Not only in the place where the company has its headquarters, but also in the place where the services are being sold. Currently, taxation is connected to the physical presence of headquarters. And some countries are very keen on attracting such headquarters to their nations and thus offer very low taxation. I think probably you have an example already of a country that does that, right? In Europe.
Yes, Ireland.
Correct. Why Dublin is the headquarters of, among other things, Google?
Low taxes.
12.5% corporate tax. Very good deal. Another big country in Europe that does this kind of special things for special partners, Luxembourg, the country from which the former president of the European Commission, Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, was coming from. Lots of scandals connected to that. So basically, there's this kind of tax havens that attract a lot of the big companies. For example, in Luxembourg, a very famous American company has its European headquarters, namely Amazon.
No idea. Oh, they're in Luxembourg.
And Spotify, Swedish, but not so Swedish because of the tax. So the European Commission has initiated a procedure already last year in 2018 to try to deterritorialize tax when it comes to digital services, and in particular to digital advertisement, and to impose a 3% tax on revenue, not on profits, for companies that are really making a lot of profits, over 3 million euros. So regardless of where you are, you would pay this tax. So you could be located in Luxembourg, but you still have to pay 3% of your Swedish revenue, for example. And that's kind of the interesting idea. Do you think that had been a success or not? What do you think?
Well, I was curious as to how Switzerland fits in, because it's not in the EU, but I know Google has a headquarters there, and I think a couple others do as well.
Yes, and the reason why they have it is because they can make their own taxation policy very independently. So Switzerland is not involved in these conversations, but some other countries who are not members of the European Union are, namely the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That includes countries from all over the world, including the United States and, for example, South Korea, very digitally pioneering countries. So the proposal of the European Commission to impose a digital tax about 3% has been rejected by the European member states, primarily by Sweden, Ireland, Finland, and Denmark.
Interesting Nordic bias there.
And you know why? There's actually a very clear explanation. I first was thinking, why would they do that? Because they love taxes in the north, right? But these countries sell a lot outside their territory. They're export countries because their population is very small. And what do they sell? They don't sell products. They don't sell physical things. They sell digital things, design and apps of various kinds. They're computer games. Think about Finland and computer games. They're like definitely ruling that field if we compare that even with the United States. So these countries said it is not advantageous for our economies to tax these type of industries because we will be at a disadvantage. Let's move this into the OECD arena, which means that the United States should also regulate should also have some form of digital tax, and South Korea should also have a digital tax, and only then would the European Union as a whole introduce it. However, several member states, almost half of the member states of the European Union have their own national digital tax. Prominently, France has, and Germany. So again, I think we will see the tax tool used to regulate revenue. Again, the European Commission has been quite aggressive in the person of Margrethe Vestager in hunting down various tech companies that did not pay their rightly due in taxes. And I think this is only the beginning of a longer discussion. But I just wanted to put it on the agenda.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. One is it reminds me when you mentioned France of one of Trump's tweets this year where he was blasting Macron for digital taxes and wrote something like, "I've always said American wine is better than French wine," to which I agree.
Well, I think this is a matter of debate, but I think definitely there was a retaliation from the U.S. side because of this digital tax that the French government introduced.
But the second one, and the kind of more thought-provoking one, is, I mean, to what extent do you think this is an outcome of Europe's essential failure in having any of these large tech companies?
Yeah, definitely. I think if they were the US and their companies would be the one being taxed, they probably would feel more protectionistic towards their interests, just as the United States government is towards these GAFA companies, right? And that's why Sweden, that has Spotify, among others, is trying to prevent this measure from getting too much traction. So I definitely think it has to do with that, but it also has to do with a modernization of the tax system. Again, Europeans kind of aced this system quite many centuries ago, and it's outdated. Tech companies or not tech companies included, I think the digital single market, which is the borderless space within the EU for any digital services, needs to be controlled in some ways. And I think the taxation tool was one that was very readily available. And it's almost impossible not to think of it. I think people also find it fair. So surveys that looked at perception of this measure, positive or negative among European citizens, found a lot of support that these companies should be taxed. And if I'm not mistaken, similar surveys in the United States also found the same thing, that they thought digital companies should pay taxes.
Yeah, because I know if you try to run an ad on social media, for example, in the EU, you still have to pay VAT, value added tax.
Yeah, which is a different type of tax. And this is why they use VAT, because that's a more flexible tool available to customize to different products, whereas corporate tax, which is what we're talking about, is more rigid and the nationally regulated tool. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into intricacies of this discussion, which are many, but I think it's going to be an interesting evolution, and definitely the OECD, this kind of developed world organization, has the digital taxation as one of their main topics on the agenda. So we will probably hear more about this in the 2020.
Definitely, and it's gonna be interesting with a new European Commission how that will all pan out.
Exactly.
All right, so a couple more listener questions.
Oh no, that's true. Listeners' questions.
Let's take a look here and see.
There were so many and so interesting. I think we have to pick something, and maybe we'll not have time with all of them, right?
No, but let's see. This will tie into my next gift, and that's one from Lynn, which is, if you were going to choose a defining aspect of social media and politics for 2019, what would it be? What would it be for you?
Defining aspect of how social media was used. I think I'll save this maybe maybe for my decade in review, because I think it's something that we see throughout. But I'm not going to divulge what it is for the sake of suspense. But if my number two pick, then I think it is this confluence, or this kind of interaction between a better thought interaction between the online and offline sections of political campaigning. I think that companies have now realized, politicians, but there could be also companies, have realized how important it is to play on these two different planes at the same time, or at least in a manner that is fitting. So probably that would be my pick.
Yeah, I may be misinterpreting the question a bit, or maybe bending it, but my answer is not so much how politicians used it, but I think the defining aspect of social media and politics, at least one of them this year, has just been scandal. Scandal after scandal, whether that's live streamed terrorist attacks like Christchurch, which is one of the top hashtags on Twitter, or different ad policies and the way they've been introduced in the academic space, the kind of rolling out of ad archives. It just seems that there's been a lot of public pressure on platforms, which is a continuation from other years, but I think we've just seen it all throughout this year, where just the pressure and the public outcry against these companies has been immense.
Yeah, I think definitely for me, generally looking at 2019 overall, I don't think there's like a major disruptive trend in social media and politics specifically. I think obviously we had some of these things that were very familiar to researchers like ourselves have made it all the way into the mainstream media, including the micro-targeting, political ads, data-driven campaigning, and this type of discourse that was mainstream fare at academic conferences, but maybe did not reach a wider public. And in 2019, I believe this is the case, right? That it did. So again, it's interesting. If we are to look academic, I don't think there's a revolution or anything that's super new. But I think in terms of the mainstream discourse, the citizens' level of information about these things, I think these keywords like micro-targeting and data-driven campaigning are much more present at top of mind, so to say.
Definitely. Do you see one on there you like?
Well, again, I think and we can take another one that looks at like what is different about 2019. Christina's question: what do you know about social media and politics now that you did not know on the 31st of December 2018? That's also a very difficult one, but let's just give some spontaneous answers, because we did not pick this up in take one. So
yes, but I have seen it before, obviously, and I did have to think about it a bit. And my answer has to do with something that we talked about with Adam Meldrum in episode 74, I believe it was, which has to do with the Facebook ad library or the ad archive. And when that was rolled out around the midterms last year, of course, you can go in there and search different ads and what's running. But I think what I didn't know is that campaigns and possibly even new companies are being formed around going into that archive and basically scouting out what your opponent is doing. So you can see all the different beta tests and how much money they've been spending. And then when all of a sudden you see a big spike in spending, you can kind of trace that back and say, okay, what is working, or what do the campaign think is working about this ad that's making them spending more? And obviously this takes a lot of time to dig through. And now with some APIs, you can do this a bit at scale. And so I didn't know that campaigns were using these tools in order to inform their opposition research.
Again, I also I haven't thought so very much about this question, because again we didn't discuss it before. But I'm not in a clear I'm not in a position to clearly mark something that was a revelation for me in 2019. When we look at what we have discussed, the Russian disinformation or political ads or micro-targeting, which define the kind of discussion we look at, or even this idea of protests and social media and activism. This is all, for me, established knowledge. So if I were to comment on this, I would say probably that I did not know how platforms think about it. So during the 2019 interaction I had with various representatives of platforms, it was an eye-opener for me to think about how platforms think about interactions with politics, how they want to push forward their strategic agenda, for example, regarding regulation, self-regulation, and the limits of taxation, which was something that we talked about before. Also, I did not know the extent to which artificial intelligence algorithms were used to filter and promote, respectively, content. I've been given more thought to artificial intelligence in general throughout 2019, and that led me to see how important these machine learning, deep learning algorithms are for the functioning of the platforms that we use in the everyday, from YouTube to Google searches to Instagram and so on and so forth. That famous app, like how do you look if you were 10 years older, or and so on. The Face app, that's a superb example of how to recruit or how to generate data, input data to refine your algorithms for aging.
And every Facebook profile picture, facial recognition, you know?
Absolutely. And I think this is a very interesting, for example, a way for social media companies to gather a lot of data and to refine their proprietary artificial intelligence algorithms. So that aspect I was probably not so aware of before 2019, but I'm sure that it has been at work all the time. It's just my personal awareness that that defines that moment for me.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we're kind of late to understand all of the intricacies of these platforms, as they, you know, tend to be quite secretive. But I think it just has to do with the scale of data. You just have to have some automated systems managing.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think Facebook was saying that for some years now they have an artificial intelligence algorithm that detects fake accounts and eliminates something in the region of 95 or more. I don't remember the percentage exactly, but definitely almost all of them almost as soon as they are created, because they present a certain pattern of behavior, and so they can take them down before they even start to perpetrate propaganda. So I think artificial intelligence and its use in social media was something that was more of a revelation for me personally in 2019.
Yes. All right. Third gift.
Third gift from me or for you? Who's doing it? You, right?
I guess, yes, I'll go. It's a short one, which is basically looking at the political ads and the responses to them. Obviously, as we've been talking about, micro-targeting been in the news a lot, not particularly in 2019, but definitely a continuation of a longer trend. And particularly looking at how Twitter has decided to ban political ads on October 30th, which generated quite a bit of discussion. So we have to keep in mind, and of course it's been mentioned in the media as well, that Twitter's political ad revenue, not so much. Do you have an idea about how much they made on political ads?
I don't have a number, but I know that it was not very significant. Do you have a number?
So $3 million during the 2018 midterms, which, just to give you a sense, that accounts for 0.46% of the $650 million in overall ad revenue that they made in the third financial quarter of 2018. So and I think that 0.46%.
It's a drop in the sea.
It's a drop in the sea, and that 0.46% mostly came from three candidates that were campaigning at the national level. And so I think that says something.
Midterms may not be also very, very, yeah.
Well, I think it's more.
It's a perfect case for Twitter.
It's not the perfect case, but Twitter isn't really the perfect case. And I think what a lot of academics were writing about in different op-eds was that this is a bad move for democracy because non-established candidates are being limited in their
discriminated, basically.
Exactly, in their ability to actually campaign. But that may be true in some cases, like with Facebook. But with Twitter, it's just not a big deal. And I remember hearing in the 2017 Senate hearings, when the different representatives from the companies were testifying in the Senate, that the representatives from these companies were saying, or at least this may be impartial data because they didn't know to have they didn't have the full story at the time. But the IRA, the Russian Internet Research Agency, only spent about $400 on Twitter versus over 100,000 on Facebook. So Twitter's just
either way, not huge amounts of money, but obviously so much more on Facebook.
Definitely. And it's just
so it's basically what you're trying to say, if I understand you correctly, is that it's not surprising for Twitter to ban political ads because it was a secondary source of income, secondary mildly put, whereas for Facebook that was much more of a significant source of revenue.
Yes, and I think it's I think it's actually more of a kind of strategic positioning by Twitter to look at all of these scandals that have been going on and to basically kind of make this look good, but it's not really affecting their bottom lines that much. I mean, Twitter's populated by so many bots and automation. You don't really need to advertise on Twitter. You can just sick your bots out and have them do dirty
Which is
work.
exactly what people would say that that's the reason maybe why they don't spend money on Twitter. That's why they only spend $400, right?
That's even what one of the former operatives from the IRA said in an interview in the kind of Russian press, is that like, yeah, we didn't spend money on Twitter because we didn't have to. We had bots. So a little bit of a PR move. I think the conversation.
Also, again, a competition. Just to bring back to the year in review discussion, what drives interest and commentary and attention is the Facebook versus Twitter discussion in this particular arena. So that's maybe a driver for the extra mediatic attention to the political ads issue. Yeah. That they had two different, very radical positions because, again, we didn't specify, but Facebook allowed, like it made the opposite movement. It allows all political ads without any kind of fact checking. So whereas Twitter bans everything, Facebook allows everything, right? Yeah. So quite clear polarized position, which determines a lot of this interest in the matter.
And Facebook has this kind of poorly designed ad archive that
I have lots of criticism about that, including of the name. The very name is misleading because archive or library implies a certain systematic collection, and archive even a complete collection, and obviously we already know.
And it's interesting to note that they changed from archive to library, which is, says
which
something.
Precisely, but this again, looking at the subtleties of the language, to call it an archive would be a lie. Library is slightly more interpretable.
Definitely.
But anyway, beyond that, I think it's interesting thing, not new, but giving new meaning in the context.
But I just wanted to point out that, so that's the Facebook approach, the Twitter approach, and then Snapchat has like all their political ads opened. You can just download a Excel file of all of them. And what it makes me think about, or the kind of interesting part, I think, is that right after all of this Russian disinformation scandals, the commitment from the platforms was that we will self-regulate by sharing across industry. So more industry collaboration in order to stop this phenomenon. And actually, I think
industry-wide norms.
Exactly. And actually what we're seeing now is everyone kind of going their own way, which is not what they promised. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how that unfolds in the
which will be used against them, right? Like you said you can, but obviously you cannot. So you need this external.
And Facebook, the big player, obviously Mark Zuckerberg having his speech in DC and meeting with Trump. I mean, he's kind of going on the offensive now. So it'll be interesting to see how that
Yes, I'm very excited for 2020. 2019 is a nice, but more of a transition year, I would say. I think the big guns will be out in 2020. So that will be a year in review to remember.
Indeed.
Because we'll have lots of exciting things.
So that's it. I have plenty more to say about the ad archives, but I will turn it over in the interest of time. Do you want to
do you want to do a gift, or do you want to take a listener question? What do you feel like?
Up to you.
I can do the gift, and then we can take one more session with the listeners before we look at the review of the decade very briefly. Mm-hmm. All right. I'm also going to keep it as short and sweet as I can. Also because it kind of connects with what you were saying. And my third gift is, again, bringing up something that was old, but again, got new wind in its sail, the topic of disinformation. I think, again, if you were to look at the frequency of the word disinformation in any kind of media coverage of anything connected to social media, it's like, oh my God, it's an overwhelming amount of discussion. And I think that it may be actually a little bit disadvantageous. So one of my first comments about this is that if everything is disinformation, if everything can be labeled disinformation, every conversation that, or every ad or every campaign that uses, for example, micro-targeting, is this disinformation? I would definitely be careful when I go down that road. The same when thinking about Russian influence, as one of the listener questions also asked us. Is this Russian influence? Is this disinformation campaign? I think the overuse of disinformation, sometimes, so to say, without any bad intention, sometimes perhaps to confuse the discussion, only helps those who really do the disinformation, who really have orchestrated paid campaigns to disseminate lies and change and promote a certain political outcome. So I think this is the biggest risk that I see in the overuse of disinformation and overuse of the label of fake news, disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. Confusion, terminological confusion, and overuse, which means that if everything is disinformation, then nothing is disinformation. Everything is equal. And this is obviously the very dangerous path to go down to. And that's why, as an academic, I feel like it's my responsibility to say, let's take it easy and think about what we label disinformation, because not every thing that circulates online that we don't agree with is disinformation. There are some other criteria. And again, I'm not going to go into the discussion of terminological distinctions right now, but just wanted to put that out there once. And then the second thing that I wanted to mention in connection with disinformation is that even though the discourse has been focusing so very much on online disinformation and the strategic uses that social media has received for disinformation actors, including, for example, in the British campaign recently ended, where, for example, the main account of parties on Twitter changed their name. The Conservatives changed their name on Twitter from the Conservative headquarters to Fact Checker. I think this, even Twitter actually intervened and said that this is purposefully misinterpreting reality, and so they asked, the Twitter company asked the account to revert to its original name. But so many other pages were created where the Tory manifesto or the Labour manifesto purportedly described the political agenda of these parties, but actually were parody accounts or criticism of the accounts, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of disinformation online, but there's a lot of disinformation offline. And this is something that, again, we tend to forget. This is where disinformation started. Disinformation or campaign to try to convince or persuade people, citizens, using false information are very, very old. And just again, looking at the case of the GE elections 2019, we have seen the printing of fake newspapers, paper-based newspapers. They looked as if they were official newspapers, media-generated official journalistic information, but the whole text, including the front page, was nothing but propaganda in favor of various parties. And in fact, all the parties, or at least Lib Dems, the Tories, and Labour, used such fake newspapers as some form of campaign leaflet disguised in a different format. So fake news, literally, in this case. So again, going back to what I wanted to comment before, offline and online, they must be seen as the same ecosystem. And I think the improvement of the campaign has been towards this integration of their off and online strategies.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you say, being careful to not overextend how, what counts as disinformation. I mean, we've seen Trump use that strategy effectively with fake news, right?
Yeah.
Just
if everything is fake news, if New York Times is fake news, then everything is fake news.
And
that's why we discredit mainstream media and journalism as a practice.
Exactly. I was going to say is that it just kind of, it allows people to have this ammunition to discredit views they don't agree with as simply fake news, which is not actually what it is.
And this is what I think is the biggest danger. And that's why I would encourage, in particular, journalists, if anyone listens to this part of the podcast, that whenever they want to label something disinformation, they should, take a pause and think, do they really want to do that? Is it really applicable? But yes,
Yeah,
that was my third gift.
Yeah, it makes me think also about all these, there's been such a rise in fact-checking organizations and the addition of these different trust indicators on why am I seeing this ad? Why am I seeing this article? Who wrote this article? What's the context? And I don't know how effective those really are at the end of the day. I think people just need to
fact-checking?
Yeah, or when people read these fact-check stories versus non-fact check stories, it doesn't seem to have a big effect.
No, I recently read an article just 2 days ago. So that said that indeed there is an effect from the citizens, and when they realize they have been lied to, that they are disappointed and the politician loses points in their view. Of course, the problem with overusing disinformation is that you don't trust anyone to reveal the disinformation. If all media lies, then who is to tell the truth that this is indeed fact-checked and incorrect? So if that is your standpoint, then everything is very relative, and then you feel very very lost. I think this is the worst outcome of this. Citizens are disoriented, lost. They lost trust not only in politicians, that was always pretty low, but not always, but in recent years pretty low, and now they have lost trust in the media institution. So who should they turn to?
It's
They're
very
more
hard.
prone to go outside the mainstream. Yeah,
It's very hard, even when you're someone whose job it is to look up information. It becomes really hard to kind of cut through the spin, the bias, which is not necessarily disinformation. Everything is just spun so
exactly.
One way or the other. It's really hard.
You have to
cut
read through, and it takes a lot of mental energy to decode. It's not just the text, but you have to know the source, the context, simultaneous events that this is a response to, and so on. So it does really take a lot of energy. I don't think it's reasonable to expect that regular citizens who have full-time jobs and families and so on have to engage in this very critical reading of every news they receive. There needs to be this level of trust in some media source.
Yeah, this is where I think platforms like Wikipedia and Reddit are super interesting, because they use all of this energy in a decentralized manner. So you have, tens of thousands of people editing Wikipedia. And of course there's different wars about who's editing what, but I tried editing some things, I think it was last year, and man, those bots and also people, they come after you if you mess up, and it's hard to figure out there's all these rules. And so I think also with Reddit's upvote downvote system, that is an interesting way to kind of get a little bit more to cut through the noise, because so many people are active in
also the role of moderators.
Yeah.
As well. This brings me maybe to a listener question, your comment, basically looking at Lynn's second question, if you look at it as well. Are we moving in the direction of platform-specific politics? How big is the influence of the companies behind the platforms in this process? I think this is definitely your cup of tea, so I think you should have the first word there.
I think it's huge. And I think it's something that we haven't, as researchers at least, paid so much attention to. We tend to look at how politicians use the platforms without really taking into account these platforms as agents in and of themselves. And I think whether it's the terminology change between the library and the archive, or removing likes and not removing likes, all these decisions are made by really smart people. Everything's beta tested. And I think we talked a little bit about it already, all the different strategic positioning, particularly around ad policies in this case. But I think that these companies are taking very, very political positions, mostly around freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And it's interesting, as we mentioned, to watch these platforms diverge on certain issues. And I think that says a lot about these platforms as actors, but particularly about the people who own them, right? Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg, as very, very powerful people in today's day and age.
I know. And I think it's interesting to also look maybe outside the very clear social media platforms and look at what you were suggesting before, like forums like Reddit or encyclopedias like Wikipedia. They also play a role in this ecosystem. Again, like they're integrated and content moves very easily across these various platforms. I think it's also something that hasn't been explored academically enough. And so we can answer the question saying, yes, yeah, there must be a difference in the way digital platforms are used by different actors differently, but we cannot really outline so much more than a very a very superficial understanding, basically looking at the different demographics of platforms, at the generational changes, TikTok versus Facebook, youth versus the retired people's crowd, and so on. So I think this is definitely something worth to compare more systematically in the future, and maybe really make a pronouncement of this. Also use interviews. I think it would be very nice to compare the way the platform representatives themselves portray themselves in comparison with others. Like what makes them different, what makes them special, or do they think that they belong together in the same tech industry label, or so on. So I would like to do more of this work in the future.
Which is interesting because I think the digital campaigners, we've asked dozens of questions about this on the show, like, to what extent do you use platforms differently? But there hasn't been much research looking at actually to what extent are they using these platforms differently.
But what did they say? I mean, you asked the questions from the digital campaigners. What was their answer, if you could summarize, or is different from each one?
Twitter for journalists, Facebook for advertising, more generally the targeting, Snapchat, Instagram behind the scenes. That's that. But I think there's I'm working a bit on this at the moment, there's a risk that these digital campaigners are overstating the extent to which they use these platforms differently, because there is quite a bit of the same content recycled across social media. So, which gets down to just a matter of resources.
Resource effectivity, right?
At the end of the day, campaigns are under a huge amount of pressure. They're limited in their budgets and their staff. But also, I think it's probably different between 2016 and 2020. I think maybe there is more awareness about differences in the platforms. But then again, the platforms are also converging in interesting ways, right? We're seeing stories.
In some ways they do, and in some other ways they don't. And so these kind of alliances, which platforms are converging on which agenda point, is very flexible. There's not a very clear and unifying trend. At least this is my opinion.
Indeed. One more question, so make sure we get everyone who submitted one. This one from Lenny. What have been the most powerful strategies in online political campaigns this year? Any guesses what we might see next year regarding the US presidential elections? Which I think is going to be definitely interesting. You've been mentioning how 2019 was a bit of a nothing new year, but we know campaigns drive the innovation, and of course American campaigns, because of the money involved.
That's where the money is, exactly.
Definitely push that border. I'm not sure what the most powerful strategies have been this year, because we've had a lot of different campaigns, but European Parliament elections.
Yeah, I'm thinking, for example, this kind of, I'm thinking also European campaign, the EP campaign, excuse me, but also Beto O'Rourke, if you remember him, now he's treated as a has-been, but for the longest time, he was an up there candidate. So, these two come to mind, but surely there's some other examples of campaigns that try to really go grassroots and connect intimately to the micro level. And I'm not thinking micro targeting, which is what everybody is doing whenever they can, but micro individuals. So they want to reach out and use individual supporters as multipliers of their message. And that brings them a lot of authenticity. Also, it makes the message slightly more customized, more not repeated ad nauseum, same slogan on and on again, but allowing different people in different contexts to repurpose the main message of the campaign, either the European Parliament or Beto's campaign as well, and give them more credibility in that sense. So I think this is one, for me, defining strategy for 2019. Again, I don't think it's revolutionary. I don't think it's the first time it's used, but I think it's been used maybe on scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think looking ahead, if I had some predictions to make, it would be, I think peer-to-peer texting. We've talked about that on the show. I think that's definitely an interesting medium that will be more widely adopted. And another thing that I think is super fascinating is this OTT, or over-the-top advertising, where you're advertising on streaming platforms like Hulu, for example, where it's like television because you're targeting people who are watching TV, not classical TV, but the cord cutters. But then again, you can probably get more data out of that type of advertising than on traditional television. And people are just moving towards streaming, right? Disney Plus, Netflix, Apple TV, all of these different streaming services. Political
Amazon.
campaigns are going to tap into that as well. So
it brings the combination of micro-targeting associated with social media and the big public associated with classic television, cable TV. So probably it's a good marriage there. So yeah, I think this is also, again, very different looking at the United States and other cases around the world. And I think definitely the United States is going to be a trendsetter again. But I'm curious if there will be any radical innovation in 2020 compared to 2016. This whole micro-targeting that broke the bank when it comes to Donald Trump's success probably is there to stay, as much as it's not going to be regulated. And there's some people that call for a ban on micro-targeting, but personally, I don't think this is going to fly.
Especially when micro-targeting helps put people in office.
When everyone may benefit, right? Micro-targeting is a tool that is equally serving all political ideologies. Yes. Shall we then wrap it all up with a long distance, la longue durée, as the French say, and look at a decade in review? Again, not really doing it justice, but just trying to identify maybe one feature that would define the entire 10-year period that ends pretty much in 2019 now, in the very last minutes, days of 2019.
Yeah, I think, for me, it's a very simple one, and that's protests and protest mobilization. Since the Arab Spring, basically, which was 2012, 2011, social media has just been able to connect people in ways that has facilitated massive protests pretty much in every part of the world, even China, which is interesting. And Russia and
dictatorships
Europe,
have not been, but Iran, think about that.
So with perhaps the exception of Australia, I'm sure there's an exception there, but protests, just social media connecting people, the classic connective action of Bennett and Segerberg's article. If you can go on Wikipedia and look at the list of protests, and you'll just see after 2009, 2010, when social media really caught on, you just see protests happening all the time. And of course, that's because of real concerns outside of social media, but social media just makes it easier for these campaigns to organize, to move during the protests, right? Live
Think about Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring. I think this is one of the impetus behind the thinking around social media and protests and social movements.
But I think what's interesting as the decade has gone on is that during the Arab Spring, social media was seen as this, positive for democracy, enabling everyone to connect and empowering.
Working for democracy, indeed, yeah.
Empowering the oppressed to very much, of course, the technologies have changed, but the general principle is similar over the past 10 years. And now, all of these platforms are in the hot seat. They're seen as corroding democracy, allowing foreign interference. So it's been interesting to see how that switch has changed.
Yeah, definitely. I agree that protests have definitely been at the top of the agenda of the decade.
Indeed. So what about yours?
Well, I'm not going to look so much at content as you, but I'm going to look at the feature. So again, kind of complementary to your perspective. And namely, I'm going to nominate stories as the feature of the decade. There were some other pretty good candidates like memes and GIFs, but I think these transcend the strict periodization in years and decades. And I think stories are simply something that you can date and you can see how they trended. And again, we talked briefly about Snapchat at the beginning of our conversation this evening. And I think one of the reasons for its at least temporary downfall has been the possibility of that idea to be transferred successfully to a platform that had originally more subscribers than Snapchat, namely Instagram. basically, I'll sound very, very radical, but not surprising, I suppose, saying that Instagram stories killed Snapchat stories.
Definitely.
And even Facebook, the parent company for Instagram, has now stories. Not popular, but it's nevertheless part of the products that Facebook is producing for itself. However, Instagram stories are probably the most important feature of the platform. I think it would be nice to see if there was something in the year in review about it, but probably they don't disintegrate this kind of content. My hint, without being systematic about it, would be that stories would get more views and more engagement than actual pictures, because this is the trend that I can see in my own microcosmos of interactions. And I've read superficial analysis, but nevertheless pointing analysis that was this trend. Stories are more immediate, they're video, they're more again, like Snapchat, more spontaneous. People can allow themselves to be less filtered, actually, despite the fact that Instagram is associated with a very idea of filtering, right? So I think stories are really the feature of the decade. And in connection with that, I would also proclaim Instagram as the social media platform of the decade, not only because it was started at the 2009-2010 period, but also because it took off just amazingly in the span of these 10 years that we're looking at. And it generated such an amazing change in mindset when it comes particularly to marketing and brand promotion, but also in terms of visual communication. I think this is also looking forward and trying to look into the crystal ball for the future, in particular academic research. I think we will see a focus on visual communication, partly because of Instagram, partly because of YouTube, that also basically took off in the decade that we're talking about right now, but in particular, again, focusing on Instagram. I think it's amazing how it became a habitual place for everyday interactions, and how it became a certain style. I maybe go a little bit off the grid or off politics here, but I recently read a very interesting analysis about the Instagram face that was published in
What's the Instagram face?
The Instagram face is pretty amazing. Again, something you don't think about, but it's a beauty ideal that is partly filtered, partly achieved through makeup, but apparently increasingly also achieved through plastic surgery. And there are many characteristics of it, but what I thought was very interesting is that the multi-ethnic type of beauty. So this Instagram face, if you can portray it in your mind, would borrow, for example, a small European nose, high cheekbones that remind of the Middle Eastern or Central Asian types, eyes that are kind of cat-eyed, like small and almond-shaped, a little bit Asian style, and a very thick and round lip that is classical African-American style.
And that's the Instagram face?
That's the Instagram face. And the skin tone that is not too white and not too dark, kind of a bronzy type. And hair that is not too black and not too blonde, just like a brown with streaks.
And what's the idea? This face is the most Instagram worthy? Or?
This is the face that people want to achieve. When you say, like, what do you think is beautiful? How would you like, and I'm talking about youth, particularly female youth. What do you think is beautiful? How would you like to look like if you were to choose? And this would be what they would like to be. And this is almost an impossible feature, because again, it's like a total multi-ethnic combination that genetically rarely occurs.
Yeah, you need some CRISPR or something.
Yeah, I have no idea how you could do it in real life, but people would achieve it through digital manipulation, or even more seriously through surgery, through implants and all sorts of things, which I'm not entirely familiar with, as you know. So
yeah, I think the effects.
What I want to say, like, Instagram has this amazing effect that people would go and change their face because of the certain beauty idea. That's what I want to say, like, the power of Instagram and why it's the platform of the decade.
I mean, yeah, it's super interesting in the sense of, I mean, it's very well designed. I think most of us have seen this video of the chimpanzee scrolling around on Instagram.
Yeah, my God, it's intuitive.
But
the
it's built around photo sharing, which is like kind of the simplest idea. But at the same time, I think you're right in that it has so many reverberating effects. I would love to know what percentage of smartphone hardware sales could be attributed to Instagram. Like everything's
what do you
about
mean, hardware sales?
like everything's about the new camera. What type of camera does this phone
Or
have?
you can buy like a light that you can connect to your Instagram, like to take better selfies.
And to what extent are people buying phones for the higher megapixel camera so they can take better Instagram pictures, not just pictures overall?
There's Instagram tourism for sure. Like there's some places that that have become touristic destination because they're particularly colorful and Instagram friendly.
And you can take these tours. I've seen them on Airbnb where you can hire someone to do an Instagram photo shoot where people change their clothes. They don't look like they've taken pictures on the same day, which they have.
Wow.
And these Instagram meetups to be an influencer where people follow each other and they pay each other to be on each other's stories. And so, what is the
collaborative projects that people don't necessarily compete, like I'm a travel blogger and you're a travel blogger. No, together we can create a mutual interest and so on.
But and what are the effects in terms of tech addiction, narcissism? I mean, Instagram is an
think about the
platform.
Instagram face, huh?
Yeah, interesting.
So anyway, I really think it's a very interesting space, not very directly political, but with definite clear social and economic impacts that necessarily will spill over into politics.
Definitely. And we'll see, I guess, what the new decade brings. Will we have Facebook in 2030? Who knows?
I don't know, but I pretty am sure that we will have a variant of Instagram. I'm pretty sure that will stick around.
Yeah.
That's my tip.
AR, that's what I'm waiting for. A little bit more augmented realities. I don't know what happened to those Google glasses, but they sound like a cool idea.
They were not deemed economically viable, but I don't think they're dead. I think they're just put on ice and further refined.
Well, speaking of putting on ice, shall we close it down?
Yes. I think
listeners
we've done a pretty good job at charting 2019 and the whole decade before it. So I think there's a lot of information already in this packed episode.
Definitely. And so, as always, tell a friend, tell a colleague about the show. Looking forward to bringing you some great content in 2020 and beyond. So for Anna Maria Ducek-Segiston, I'm Michael Becerra. See you next year.